So let's talk about the trial of Officer Brett Hankerson and the death of Breonna Taylor. My name is Nathan Laurie. If you are new here, we talk about the law and the facts. If you're about that life, don't forget to like this video, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. So we are back talking about the Breonna Taylor story. Now, this is a story I covered maybe about a year and a half, 2 years ago. It did very well, that video, where I broke down the entire story and pointed out to where the media had presented misinformation about it. That video is going to pop up somewhere here, so if you want to go check it out. Now, from that event, one of the officers at the scene was actually charged with the crime. That officer is Brett Hankerson. Now, he wasn't charged in the death of Breonna Taylor, but he was charged with essentially what's known as reckless endangerment of other citizens in the apartments because he fired his gun allegedly recklessly into other apartments. First, let's talk about who Brett Hankerson is. Well, he was a police detective and he has 20 years experience on the force, and he was part of the team that was going on the raid of Breonna Taylor's apartment. Now, I have watched both his interview with police and most of the interviews from the people who were there during the raid and even the SWAT commander's interview. And this breakdown by the New York Times incorporates all those interviews and all of the witness testimony and gives us a nice reenactment that I think is pretty much on point when it comes to the facts of the case. Now, there is some spin within this reenactment, which I'll point out from time to time, but generally they do a good job at putting out the facts of what actually happened during the shooting. Now, what is Officer Brett Hankerson being charged with? Well, he's being charged with 3 counts of what's known as wanton endangerment. And in most states, we call it reckless endangerment. But essentially, he's being charged with using his firearm recklessly in a situation that could have gotten other people harmed or killed. Now, I want to be more specific here. Specifically, he's being charged with discharging his firearm, creating an unreasonable risk of severe injury to other persons. Now, when we're trying to show that Officer Brett Hankerson acted unreasonably, what we're saying is that based on the officer's training and experience, that another officer would not have acted the same way if they were put in these circumstances. Now, the first thing a lot of people will say is, why is this case different than Kim Potter, who shot Daunte Wright and claimed that she didn't know she had a gun in her hand, she thought it was a taser? Wasn't she also being reckless? Well, the difference between these two cases is what's known as a conscious disregard of a risk. So with Kim Potter, she was actually unaware that she had created this dangerous risk of discharging a firearm in that situation because she only thought she had pulled the taser. Remember, those were undisputed facts within the case, as the judge said. But here with Hankerson was consciously aware that he pulled his firearm, and he was consciously aware he was firing his firearm into these locations. So there is no issue whether Hankerson mistakenly or intentionally shot his weapon or even drew his weapon and pointed it. All parties in this case were aware that Brett Hankerson was conscious that he was holding his weapon and intentionally shot it into the apartment, as we'll see soon. So essentially, Hankerson was aware that he had a gun and he was shooting it, where Potter was not aware that she had a gun and was shooting it. Now, for Hankerson to be found guilty, or for him to be found guilty here on YouTube, you're going to have to be convinced of 3 things beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that Brett Hankerson was conscious that he had a gun in his hand. Second, that he intentionally fired his weapon into the apartment. And third, that the shots that he fired were unreasonable based on the situation. Now, to help you understand whether Brett Hankerson was being unreasonable or not, you need to understand what police are trained to do in situations when they're using their firearms. See, police are not trained to fire blindly into situations where they don't know what's there. Now, there are 3 basic rules when you're about to employ deadly physical force with your firearm. And that's number 1, you identify a target. Police aren't trained to just shoot blindly into spaces. They have to identify a target that they're trying to stop. Second, they have to know what's in front of their target. Because let's say if they have a hostage or if they're behind a group of children, that would make a difference whether the officer is going to discharge his weapon or not to endanger other people. And then third, you should also know what's behind the target. Because even though you may have a clear shot to that target, bullets do travel through bodies, and you don't want to endanger people behind it or hurt anyone behind it. Now, obviously, each situation is different and there's going to be nuance, but those are the 3 general principles. If you're going to use your firearm in a situation like that, you need to know what you're shooting at, what's in front of it, and what's behind it. Simple enough. And simply put, if the state can prove that Officer Hankison didn't make the proper assessment before using his firearm, then you should find him to be guilty of these crimes. Now, one of the most important things we have to understand is hindsight is not allowed. So you must judge this officer's actions based on what he knew at the time and not what we know now. So for instance, if Officer Hankerson shot in one direction and now we know that, hey, no one was there, we would have to actually disregard that and think about, well, what did Officer Hankerson believe at the time when he discharged the shots? Because something could have been there that would have made him believe that this was justified or not, if that's appropriate. So with all that said, let's now look at the reenactment to see what happened. Now, Brett Hankerson has been found not guilty of all of these charges. So this review is just to determine whether you as a member of the jury would have also agreed with that determination. Where we're starting from is this is Breonna Taylor's apartment, and they're explaining to you the situation, the lighting, and what happened. So we're just going to go through all of this and see exactly what happened. Now, specifically, we're trying to understand Officer Brett Hankerson and whether he was reckless when he fired shots into the apartment. So this gives us the full context of the lighting situation, what was seen, what was happening, how chaotic the scene was, and what Officer Brett Hankerson did at this time. So let's watch.
For now, the police begin to stack. In this reconstruction, we hear the official testimonies given by the two officers nearest the door.
Now, this is why I like this reenactment, because it uses the official testimonies of the officers who were there at the scene, Brett Hankerson, Mattingly, and what it does, by doing that, you can actually line up what happened with what they said happened. So let's check it out.
Mattingly and Nobles, Cosgrove, who's providing cover, and Hoover and Hankinson beside them. And we'll hear from neighbours and Kenneth Walker, who was interviewed by police right after the shooting.
When we all got up in line, I knocked on the door, banged on it.
Just as Mattingly begins to knock, a man emerges from the apartment directly above. He doesn't live there, but is picking up his child after finishing work.
The door right there, that's why the babysitter leave. So I came to pick up my little girl.
A squabble with Detective Brett Hankison ensues, and already the team seems on edge.
I remember Brett extending his gun saying, "Get back in your apartment, get back in your apartment." Brett was a little bit worked up. I remember looking at Brett saying, "Brett, relax. Brett, just relax, relax."
This first part shows you a little something. It shows you that Brett Hankerson, maybe he had too much caffeine that day or something like that, but he's already on edge. And to be honest with you, what's happening here is kind of reckless endangerment as assault. He's pointing his gun at a bystander who just walked outside their door to see what was going on, right? So, he's already on edge. And here, I would suspect, why are you pointing a gun at this guy? He just walked outside saying, "Oh my God." So the sergeant is even telling him, "Hey, you got to calm down. You're a little too worked up here." So it at least gives us his frame of mind, what people perceived his frame of mind was at the time. Now, how this works into your evaluation as someone who's evaluating this, you have to take it for yourself, but this is what seems to be happening.
The man retreats inside. The police are supposed to be conducting a knock and announce raid, but that's not what Mattingly says happens at first.
That's untrue. Now, when we look at the warrant that was for Breonna Taylor's apartment, it was actually a no-knock warrant. It was actually a no-knock warrant. And I believe if they would have gone into the apartment as the no-knock warrant, then Breonna Taylor would likely have been alive today, because Kenneth Walker wouldn't have had time to go get his gun and all that stuff. But they actually took out and had a no-knock warrant. But when they went and evaluated the scene and situation, they said, well, listen, we can actually knock and announce. It shouldn't be that bad. So that's what they're doing here. Like I said, they get some of the facts wrong, but the warrant that they had for Breonna Taylor's apartment was a no-knock warrant. Now, I know people have issues with no-knock warrants, and I do too. I think they've given out a little too willy-nilly. There should be a higher standard to get a no-knock warrant. But the facts of the matter are, these cops had a no-knock warrant, and they still knocked.
We didn't announce the first couple because our intent was to give her plenty of time to come to the door.
Inside, Taylor wakes up.
So it's a loud bang at the door. She pops up out of her sleep and scared her to death. Me too. Who is that?
Banged on the door, no response. Banged on it again, no response. At that point, we started announcing ourselves.
Whether the police announced themselves clearly enough is a critical issue in this story that we'll return to later on. Not knowing who's at the door this late, Walker grabs his licensed handgun.
Another knock at the door. She's like, "Who is it?" Loud at the top of her lungs. No response.
Now, one thing I think is critical here is look where they're at in the apartment and look where the police are at. So, and they have the TV on and everything too, because even after, you'll see the TV was actually on when the SWAT team went in. So you got the TV on loud. You're falling asleep watching the movie and you're hearing banging at the door. And the police admit, the first couple of times they didn't announce, and you don't know what's going on. You get loud bangs of door. You're like, what the hell's going on? So this is the first part where I think now it kind of gets a little it gets a little like, you know, who's right and who's wrong, right? They're correct, Breonna Taylor and Kenneth Walker, because they're like, we couldn't hear them. And the police are correct if they're saying, well, we announced, but, you know, it couldn't travel through all these walls in this apartment. Here you have this weird situation where both Kenneth Walker is justified in believing that these could be intruders, and the police are justified in believing that, you know, he may have heard them say police. But that doesn't mean either side is wrong, right? Both sides could honestly be just having mistaken beliefs and be justified in their use of force. And when something like that happens, there's really nothing you can do, because I would say in this case, Kenneth Walker, if he honestly doesn't hear them say police, he's justified in doing his actions. And I believe the police would be justified in their actions because they're assuming that, you know, the worst case scenario.
So I'm like, what the heck?
They rushed to get dressed and walk toward the door.
Never even made it like mid-hallway. But as loud as we were screaming to say who it is, I know whoever would be on the other side of the door could hear us.
Outside, some of the police do hear Taylor.
I can hear somebody inside. I kept telling John, I can hear her.
But after knocking and waiting for around 45 seconds, they decided they've given her enough time to respond and rammed the door open.
The last time, I just said, let's just hit it. And that's when we did the, police search warrant.
Now, this, I think, is the critical error for the police, for instance. They've knocked a couple of times. They've waited 45 seconds. We can hear something. And Walker's in there like, I can't hear them. And they know, police know that they're banging on the door hard. Now, I think this is the part where if you just take a second to think, like, hold on, we've been banging on the door. It's late at night. Of course, people are going to be concerned. Like, who the hell? Just imagine somebody comes and knocks on your door at 10, 11 o'clock at night, banging, banging, banging really hard. You're going to be apprehensive to go to the door. Like, who the hell will be knocking on the door versus ringing the doorbell or something like that? So, again, this is what I mean. Both sides could be justified in the way they feel about the threat. You know, if I'm Kenneth Walker, I'm like, who the hell is banging at the door? And if I'm the cops, I'm like, why the hell isn't he telling us, why isn't he opening up the door? So that's the situation that we find ourselves in. And giving somebody 45 seconds to come to the door is not enough time. I'm just going to say it. It takes, 45 seconds just to go run to your door, especially when you're all the way in the back watching the movie, got to get dressed, get your gun. You got to think about it.
We'll show here what the police and Walker describe seeing next.
And I hit it. After the third hit, it flew open. And that's when it hit the fan.
As we're coming to the door like comes off the hinges like an explosion.
The officers now make a tactical mistake. Mattingly steps into the doorway and puts himself in what police describe as the fatal funnel.
Now, the fatal funnel is, imagine this, if you're in a dark place and the only light you see is coming through a doorway. So if police step into that doorway, they're giving whoever's inside them as targets because you're shooting right to the light and the light is behind the police. So they can't actually see where you're at inside. So it's a horrible scenario to be in. So what happens is if someone has a gun, they're going to shoot toward the light, which is shooting toward the police in that narrow area.
A position vulnerable to gunfire and hard to move from.
I could see down the hallway, and there's the male and a female side by side, shoulder to shoulder. It almost like they were together.
The apartment is lit only by the breezeway light that's coming from behind Mattingly and the faint glare of the TV in Taylor's bedroom.
So you can see it from Taylor's perspective or from Walker's perspective here on the right-hand side of the screen. And you can see the police perspective on the left-hand side of the screen.
You can't see anybody, though. It was dark. There was no lights.
Thinking it's an intruder, Walker aims low, shoots once, and hits Mattingly in the thigh.
I feel like I aimed down because I don't need to kill anybody. So I just let off one shot.
Mattingly immediately returns fire.
I got 4 rounds off, and it was like boom, 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 boom.
Then all of a sudden there's a whole lot of shots.
Mattingly fires 2 more rounds when he falls and takes cover. Almost at the same time, Cosgrove moves in and fires, stepping on Mattingly in the process. He has now also put himself in the fatal funnel, and although he's shooting, he appears to have no idea what's happening.
I see blinding, vivid, white light and blackness at the same time. I don't hear any gunfire at all, ever. And I did not have any pain sensation or any recollection that I'm firing.
He continues shooting.
So he's stressed out. He doesn't even know he's firing a gun. That shows you the type of fear and stuff that this guy's in. And he just fires because he just saw his guy get shot, and he's just letting off shots. He doesn't even realize he's firing his gun, to show you how extreme the situation is for him. And he's right in the middle of the fatal funnel. So if somebody's returning fire, they could return fire toward him, and he's honestly shooting toward where he saw the bullet come from.
Blindly until he runs out of ammunition, a total of 16 rounds.
If you told me I didn't fire a gun, I'd be like, okay, I believe you.
In response to Walker's shot, Mattingly and Cosgrove together fire 4 shots into a chair, cupboards, and a stove in the kitchen. 2 bullets go into the ceiling and pass through the living room in the apartment above, where the man, his 2-year-old daughter, and babysitter waited. 3 more shots go into the living room wall to the right. And the officers fire 13 rounds down the hallway where Taylor and Walker stood. Taylor is shot 6 times on both sides of her body, in the abdomen and chest, her arm and leg, and twice in her foot. In all, these 2 officers fired 22 rounds in less than a minute. An FBI ballistics report found that both of them shot Taylor, and that one of the 16 rounds Cosgrove fired was the lethal bullet.
We both dropped to the ground, but I just hear her screaming, and
Thinking they're under attack, some of the officers flee when they hear a pause in shooting.
There was a little bitty moment of no shots. I was like, here's the time to go. And then it all started up again.
We don't know the precise sequence of events, but Detective Hankinson runs to the front.
I can hear the firing as I'm making the corner.
So now this is where Brett Hankerson, our defendant, comes into play. So shots have been fired both ways. And now Brett Hankerson is going to essentially outside the windows to see what he can see, because now he knows his guy is down and he sees there's a lot of firing going on. So let's see what he does now. And remember, this is the officer who we're focused in on. This is the one who's on trial. This is the defendant in this case. So we're trying to figure out if he's being reasonable with what he's doing.
I can see the flashes, the muzzle flashes.
But the only ones shooting are police. Even though...
Now that's important. He goes and he can see the muzzle flashes. But remember, Kenneth Walker is not shooting anyone anymore. He just shot the one shot, and now he's down on the floor because all these other shots came in. And Hankerson sees the muzzle flashes from the other officers. So let's see what he does.
All the curtains are drawn. Hankinson blindly fires 5 bullets through the patio windows.
My only option was to return fire, and I did that to the muzzle flashes.
So Hankerson goes outside. He's behind the curtains, and he sees the muzzle flashes behind the curtains. He can't see into the apartment, as you just see. So he just shoots toward the muzzle flashes through the window blindly. And just for clarification, he's actually shooting at police. So that's what we have here.
He moves and fires 5 more rounds through the bedroom window of Taylor's sister, who isn't home. 2 bullets fly over Walker and Taylor, but none hits them.
So first he shoots toward the muzzle flash with the police. The second, then he shoots toward another bedroom window, toward where I believe Taylor and the other guy are laying on the floor. So he couldn't see them because they were already on the floor when he shot. So they're laying on the floor. He shoots first at the police, then he goes and shoots at Taylor and her boyfriend who's laying on the floor.
The bullets that go into the living area pass over Taylor's sofa and kitchen table and smash her clock. 3 penetrate the wall and enter her neighbour's apartment. Those bullets also smash the kitchen table, hit a wall, and shatter the patio doors at the rear. A pregnant woman, her son, and partner were home. Hankison has been charged with wantonly endangering their lives.
Now, I fast forwarded here to the SWAT commander who was first on the scene. And he's going to speak about Brett Hankerson. And again, this is probably going to be in the trial. But during his interview, he's going to explain what he felt happened. Now, this is a 20-year vet commander of the SWAT team. And we're going to listen to his assessment of Brett Hankerson's actions at this particular scene.
The SWAT commander who was called to Taylor's home after the raid was later interviewed by investigators.
We just got the feeling that night that something really bad happened.
Dale Massey, a 20-year police veteran, was highly critical of what unfolded. He said there was no coordination with SWAT.
We had no idea they were going to be at that apartment that night. I would have advised them 100% not to do it.
And that executing another warrant at the same time may have compromised Taylor's safety.
We treat safety very important, right? So like simultaneous warrants, bad business.
Narcotics officers testified that they didn't know Taylor had a new boyfriend, that her sister lived there, or that her 2-year-old goddaughter regularly stayed. Massey said the department had a history of poor intelligence gathering.
Back in the day, we would take a lot of detective information and take it as golden. Not anymore, because so often there's no kids, there's no dogs, we're told, there's kids and dogs. So we have an exhaustive recon process that we go through.
He said standing in the doorway, the fatal funnel, as Mattingly and Cosgrove had, was a tactical mistake.
Is it practical, or is it even common for 3 people to be in what we consider the fatal funnel?
Absolutely not. No. You would never put, yourself in that situation.
And that there's a right way and a wrong way to conduct a raid. You knock, announce, and give people ample time to leave.
We're not going to rush in to get dope. We're not going to treat human life's more important than any amount of dope, right?
And
that statement, what he just said, is very important. And it's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's part of the, I like to call them the absolutes of law enforcement. Life over property, for instance. And if you can go into an apartment safely, it's better than going into the apartment unsafe and getting evidence. And I think that's what he's trying to say here. So if there was dope in there, we'd rather keep everybody alive than, go inside there and kill people and just to recover the dope, right? The dope is not as important as people's lives. And that's one of the tenets of law enforcement. So even though, don't get me wrong, contraband and drugs are bad, it's not worth someone's life.
just to be clear, no drugs were ever found at Taylor's.
Now, I'm going to rewind it because I want you to hear that part again.
No, right.
And just to be clear, no drugs were ever found at Taylor's.
This is part of the, I like to call it the New York Times misinformation campaign. There were no drugs found, and they did not search the apartment. Now, does that mean there were drugs in the apartment? No, right? There may or may not have been drugs. But the police didn't search. Saying that there were no drugs found in the apartment is correct but misleading because the police didn't search the apartment for drugs. So I think if you put it all together, it gives you a better understanding of what actually happened.
His harshest criticism was of Hankison's blind shots into the apartment.
You have to know, A, what you're shooting at, B, what's in front of it, and B, what's behind it. There's no other way you can operate. It was just an egregious act.
So that is the SWAT commander telling you that the only way you operate, know what's identify a target, know what's in front of it, behind it, and if you act any other way, it's an egregious act. You can't do something like that. Now, that SWAT commander is telling you what police procedures are. So now, I think with this reenactment, we have enough to kind of try to figure out whether this officer should be found guilty or not guilty of the crime of recklessly endangering the people in the other apartments. So back to the things that we're trying to figure out. Was Brett Hankerson conscious that he had a gun in his hand? I would say it seems so, right? He obviously was conscious. He was pointing at someone else even before this happened. Did he intentionally fire his weapon? These weren't, average shots or some misfire of the gun. He intentionally fired those shots. If we agree with those two things, your job is now to determine whether those shots that he did fire, were they reasonable or not? Did he identify a target? Did he know what was in front or behind the target? What do you believe they were egregious? Did he put other people's lives at risk? Was it that reckless? Do you believe he was justified at firing just at muzzle flashes? Or do you think that he should have at least identified a target because there was no way he could see inside the apartment? The only thing he saw was flashes and fired at flashes. Is that enough? Is that enough to say that he was being reasonable in discharging his weapon toward just muzzle flashes? Knowing that the other officers there were engaged, right? They were shooting. I could see a jury saying, well, he saw something and believing that was reasonable. But if you're talking about, if the jury thinks about police tactics and what police are trained to do, it makes it seem like it may be less reasonable. But again, that decision's up to you. So at the end of the day, let me know how you judge Detective Brett Hankerson's actions here and whether you believe that he is guilty of recklessly endangering the innocent bystanders in the other apartments by shooting recklessly into Breonna Taylor's apartment or not.